Here's our first speaker, Amy Britton. She's an investigative journalist with the Washington Post and a Pulitzer Award winner. So we're very happy to have you join us, Amy. She will be sharing how the Washington Post recently launched its first ever investigative podcast, which is called Canary, The Washington Post Investigates. And they just recently launched that a month ago, so it's very recent still. They have a team of 20 journalists contributing to this from the newsroom. So Amy, very welcome to NIS Audio, and the floor is yours.
Good morning from the States. It's pretty early here. I'm excited to see everyone. All right. So good morning. I'm here to talk about our newsroom's first ever investigative podcast. It's called Canary, The Washington Post Investigates. As you can see, this is the logo for the podcast and all of the podcast platforms. Let me move to the next one. Canary is a 7-part audio series. It's comprised of over 3 hours of audio. And as I said before, it is our newsroom's first ever investigative podcast. And before I proceed, I just wanted to let everyone know that Canary does concern issues of sexual assault. So if that is a sensitive topic for you, I'm going to be talking about it briefly in this presentation. This picture is taken during the reporting process. I am pictured crouching there on the right, holding a shotgun microphone. My producer, Rena Flores, is to the left. And the 2 women who you are seeing there on the sofa are Lauren Clark on the left and Carol Griffin on the right. They are the key subjects of this podcast. I will talk a little bit about how the podcast came into fruition, but before I move on to that, I just wanted to briefly show kind of all of the themes that are contained within the 7-part audio series. And I think this photo does a good job of representing that, because you see the 2 subjects of the piece, and the subject matter does concern sexual assault. They both have accounts of sexual assault. It's about an unlikely connection between these 2 women, and it's also about my journey as a reporter to finding the truth and kind of peeling back the curtain on the process of investigative reporting. So just to give you a little sense of how the story came to be, I started working on a story about a victim of sexual assault in DC in late 2017. This story was published in the Washington Post in print and a brief audio segment on our daily Washington Post podcast called Post Reports. It concerned this woman, pictured here, Lauren Clark, who is a hairstylist in DC, who was running one night when a stranger sexually assaulted her on the sidewalk close to her home in a neighborhood in Northwest Washington, DC. So when I published this story, her case in many ways represented a lot of the challenges that survivors of sexual assault face when they're navigating the criminal justice system. In many ways, she had a lot of factors working in her favor after her case made it into the criminal justice system. The man who assaulted her pled guilty, which is very unusual. He also admitted to attacking 5 other women in DC in very similar assaults. When this case made it to sentencing, the judge in the case, Judge Truman Morrison, who is pictured here, gave her attacker a 10-day jail sentence served over 2-day stints. And there were later failures in the case in the criminal justice system where this man was not getting the treatment that he was supposed to receive. And Lauren, the woman in the first story, had to fight for her right to really be heard and understood as a victim of this crime. So after the initial story, I moved on. There was a daily segment on the Daily Post Reports podcast. But then 2 weeks later, I received a tip related to the judge in her case, Truman Morrison. And the tip was from this woman pictured here, whose name is Carol Griffin. She lives in Birmingham, Alabama. And just for some geographical context in the United States, it's about a 2-hour flight from Washington, D.C., so not really within driving distance. This woman reached out to me and said that she had read the first story that I wrote about the sexual assault case, and that she had information directly related to that story. And her allegation was that the judge in the initial case had sexually assaulted her when she was a 16-year-old girl. So when I got this tip, my instinct was that I definitely wanted to follow up on it because the judge, Judge Truman Morrison, is at the time of this allegation, was the second longest serving judge in the District of Columbia. He had been on the bench here for over 40 years, since 1979, and is a very nationally known and even internationally known judge for criminal justice reform. So I wanted to follow up on that tip. And because I had done the initial podcast, a daily audio version of this story, I thought, well, let me take my audio equipment with me when I go to Birmingham. And just so you know a little bit about me, I have no experience in audio, which you may be wondering why I'm speaking at an audio conference. I hope that I'm here to provide a perspective of how you guys can partner with people in your newsroom who may not be experts on this subject matter, such as yourselves. Because if you can train me to do audio, I think you can train just about anyone in your newsroom to do it. So what I liked about doing audio reporting is that, as you can see, the equipment pictured here is lightweight, it's easy to travel with. So I took this recorder and batteries and a tripod with me to Birmingham for this initial interview with this woman who reached out to me. And previously in my print reporting, I probably wouldn't have done that because I would have no need to record all of this information. And when I went to Birmingham, I recorded everything. There were hours of interviews, travel, me on the plane and the cars and restaurants with people. And I really made an effort to catalog that entire weekend. And I'm going to come back to this because I think this was a crucial decision that led to the eventual development of the podcast. And if we had not recorded on this trip, I do not believe we would have had a podcast. So then when I came back from Birmingham, I had a subject who was 100% willing to participate in this process. She allowed me to record everything. And I went back, and this is Rena Flores, my producer, who's pictured here. And I said, I think we potentially have a story that's bigger than a daily podcast. I don't really think it would fully convey kind of the rare quality of the story, the fact that this woman was only coming forward because another woman, another victim of sexual assault, had come forward. I don't think a print story would necessarily convey that connection. So what do we do with this? Because at the Post, we had no history of doing this investigative podcast. So if there isn't a track forward, how do we create a path to making sure that the story is told to its full potential? There were some initial challenges. Carol's parents were not willing to participate. A lot of the responses of the judge were unknown at that point. And like I said, this had not been done before. So we were going to have to start from scratch within our newsroom. So that summer, this was the summer of 2019, we had a really intensive creative process of thinking, what could the potential of this story be? The picture here is a mood board that Rena, the producer on the story, developed. And this was developed as a way for Rena and myself to kind of communicate about our process, because I'm not an audio person and I didn't know how to communicate about how I wanted this material to sound, what I wanted the music to sound like, what I wanted the material to feel like. So she challenged me to think in very creative ways. Like, if you could listen to some audio and think about it, like, what color would that sound like? Or what image would you see if you heard this emotional phone call or this piece of tape that we have? So the mood board was the initial creative process, and it was such a fascinating creative process for me. So we moved forward with reporting and series development, and we also looped in a team of journalists outside of our small team of Rena and me to try to get them looped into this project. We brought in photographers, project designers at the end of 2019 to make sure that all of the departments in our newsroom were aware of what we were pursuing. And these are the screenshots of some of the project organization. I am not the most organized person. I kind of struggle with that. You know, I could tell you where something is, but it might take me like 30 minutes to find it. But thankfully, Rena, the producer on this piece, was super organized. So what you see here reflects her organizational skills. And once she set up the framework for me, I could definitely follow her organization. So you see all of the episode folders here. And this is a group on a platform that we have at the Post called Microsoft SharePoint. And it allows for a secure website where it's two-step authentication to get into the website, and it allows for multiple team members to be added. So as our team expanded, we would keep adding people to this group, and they would have access to all of the rough cuts of the episodes, transcripts, scripts, everything for the project lived in this website. This is a photo of our scripting process. This was before the pandemic when we were still in the newsroom. We used huddle rooms and dry erase boards to try to map out some of the organizational structure of the series. As some of you may be expert sound designers, you probably know more about what the screen is than I do, but I put it in here because it shows a process that was essential to making sure that the story reached its full potential. And I believe that one of the key aspects of success for this project was bringing in a sound designer very early on to help us shape this material and craft it to make sure that it had the right tone and the right emotional punch for the series, given just how sensitive this information was. So during the pandemic, like many of you, I'm sure, we had our lives kind of put on hold. Everyone in the Washington Post newsroom, pretty much, not everyone, but I should say a lot of us were reassigned to pandemic coverage from March to June 2020, including myself. So this picture here are some of my colleagues who were working on the podcast. This picture was taken on May 29th. And this is the meeting when we decided to resume production of Canary with the hopes that we could get it out into the world in 2020. And we had a lot of discussions about how that would be possible with all of us still working from home. We also brought in a group of what we call cold listeners, people in our newsroom who had no connection to this story, no connection to this material. And they volunteered hours and hours of their time to listen to rough cuts and to meet with us on Zoom to provide their feedback. And these are some of the questions that we asked them. You know, what doesn't make sense? Were you confused? Do you feel like we're handling the subject matter of sexual assault in a sensitive way? Is there anything that we can do better to make this story better? You know, how would you describe this podcast to a friend? All of these were key questions. And from our standpoint, we had become a little bit too close to the material. And I'm sure some of you have experienced this when you've worked on a story for a very long time, and you know the material better than anyone else, but you're also a little bit too close to it to make the tough decisions about what you need to cut. So the group of people on the screen, they're just my colleagues, they're reporters and editors, and they were fantastic in that process. Here's a photo of me in my closet. Whenever we were doing this project, you know, from 2019, if you had told me that I would do the final stage of this project for months in my closet in the middle of a pandemic, I could have never imagined what we would have faced and the challenges of making the story happen. But the good news is that a closet is a very good makeshift studio. And I stuffed in pillows and blankets and all the clothes I could find to make sure that it was a good quality. And our producer said that from what they could hear, it was just as good of a quality as actually the soundproof studios in the Washington Post newsroom. So the final stages of production involved fact-checking, legal review. You know, this story went through every type of rigorous vetting and editing process that our traditional print stories would go through. Just because it was audio doesn't mean that we changed our standards. In fact, we even elevated our standards for what it would take to publish a story of this matter. This is a picture of the design landing page that was designed this summer. If you go to WashingtonPost.com/canary, you will see this page. I think one of the aspects of it that I was very interested in is making sure at the very top of that screen, as you can see, you have the buttons for the podcast platforms for Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. So immediately you know it's an audio story and you can click out to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. We launched all 7 episodes on October 1st. That was a key decision for us rather than spread it out over the weeks because we were dealing with such a sensitive subject matter and we wanted to make sure that people had the chance to consume this story on their own time. And also we wanted to give the subjects of the piece, the 2 women and the judge, a chance for everyone to hear their responses immediately rather than waiting, you know, weeks to release additional episodes. So 1 minute left before questions. I think I will just sum up briefly the key takeaways from my perspective as someone who is not an audio expert like all of you. The key decision that we made was recording that initial trip to Birmingham. And if you're in any way considering a project like this, you have to bring in the audio gathering effort from the inception of the story. If I had not taken that tape recorder to Birmingham, we would not have a podcast. There would be no way for me to recreate that because it was such an organic, emotional process of gathering that material and taking down Carol's account of sexual assault that weekend over the reporting process. Additional takeaways are organization, as I showed you, collaboration, bringing in other partners, photo design, sound design early on. And finally, I will just say that this was an experiment for our newsroom. It was an experiment for me. It was an experiment for a lot of us who had no experience in doing this. And I think that we should be bold and take a risk like this because the payoff is tremendous. And this story has reached a tremendous audience. And I've heard from so many listeners about a connection that they felt to the story that I'm not necessarily sure that they would have felt if we had told it in a traditional print way. So please subscribe. You can find it on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify. It's called Canary, The Washington Post Investigates. And you'll understand why we called it that. Once you get to the second episode, the title is explained.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
Good morning.
How are you? Hope you're fine. I really like your presentation and you have some questions here. So we will start with Amandre. Amandre says, super interesting. I wonder what are the editorial criteria they follow to select which stories are more suitable for audio versus text.
Mm-hmm. So I can just speak from my perspective. I think that 99% of the investigative stories that we do are not necessarily suitable for audio because they involve documents, a lot of facts that sometimes can be a little bit dry. And a lot of times you don't necessarily have people who will allow you to record the conversations that you're having. I've reported extensively on sexual assault and harassment before, and I've never before this story had permission to record the types of conversations that I had. So I think it just depends on the story and making sure that you have access first and foremost, and then determining what would be the most compelling story to tell through audio.
Thank you, Amy. We have another question from Nal. Nal says, I'm curious to know how the co-listeners responded to the podcast. What changes did you make based on their feedback?
Oh, yeah. The cold listeners were amazing. I mean, I can listen to the podcast now and point out 30 examples of things that we changed because of their feedback. The very beginning, the first 2 minutes of the podcast is different because some of them felt like it was a little bit boring. We initially went with more of a structured approach of describing the criminal justice system. And they said, that's not good. You need to really hook people from the first 2 minutes of the podcast. There were also cuts that they made, moments that they felt like were dragging, where they were getting a little bit bored, and they were able to hear that when we had just become a little bit too close to the material.
Yeah, that makes sense. It happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You said. So we have another question for you from Lee. Let me see, here it is. Lee from Singapore asked, would you like to find out more about the fact-checking process? Were other reporters not involved with the story asked to fact-check?
No. So in our newsroom, we don't have outside fact-checkers. Fact-checking is done by the reporters. So my process for fact-checking is to footnote every single sentence in typically a story. In this case, it was a script. So I took every script, footnoted it with the fact. I went back and I checked the initial bytes of audio just to make sure that we weren't taking anything out of context. I also called everyone who is quoted in the podcast and made sure that I described how their remarks would be presented to make sure that I wasn't misunderstanding everything. So that process for me probably took 3 weeks of just fact checking every day. It was pretty brutal, but definitely an essential part of our job to make sure that we've made the story bulletproof.
Yeah, absolutely. As a good journalist.
Mm-hmm.
Time for 2 more questions. One is from Stella. Stella, super interesting. Thank you for sharing, Amy. Are there stories that you think actually don't lend themselves so well to the podcast format?
Yeah, a lot of them. Like I said, I mean, most of the stories that I've done before, I feel like, what made this story really special is that it involved two women and who had this connection to each other. And there's a name for the structure that I use to structure the story. It's called braided structure, like a hair braid. And if you can envision, two braids of two stories that are kind of intersecting throughout the podcast, and you're weaving those stories together. That is the structure that we used. And in many ways, I am the third braid of the story because my experience as a reporter and my journey to try to find the truth is also included in this. So I think there's a simplicity of that, of only having kind of three main braids that you're weaving. I think it gets a little bit more challenging if you're reporting on systems or more document-driven stories. Sometimes that can be really difficult to convey through audio.
We have time for one last question, Amy. It comes from Hung Nguyen. Well done, Amy. What was the audio interface that you showed earlier? Which program did you use to edit?
I'm looking. I'm actually not sure. I think it's Final Cut, but I don't use that software. That was done by our sound designer. But I can check and follow up. Do you want to take one more, Angela?
Let's take the last one from Sarah Pink. Sarah said, thank you for joining us today. Really insightful content. What was the reception be like versus the print version of investigative pieces? Do you see these platforms surviving in this industry?
Yeah, so the reception has been like nothing I've ever received before in my career. And it's fascinating because people are reaching out to me every day. I get so many emails from people. I got an email from a truck driver in Europe who was listening to it overnight when he was driving his truck. And I've gotten emails from people who have said that they've been victims of sexual abuse. And I think there's a connection that people feel with the reporting process and the reporter when you listen to someone for 3 hours and when you follow that journey that you just can't convey in print. So the reception has been overwhelming, and I'm so glad that we chose to go this route and tell this story in this way, because I don't think the reception would have been the same, or the emotional punch of the story would have been the same if we had told it in a traditional way. Also, just letting the subjects speak for themselves. You hear their voices, you hear their emotion, you hear their struggle. I'm not filtering it. You hear them in these very raw, real moments. And I do see this platform surviving. I think our newsroom has seen the success of it, and they want to find and identify more investigative audio stories to be told in this way. So now the next challenge is finding what can we do next and what story could be told in this format in the future.
Great, Amy, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today.